Hello and welcome to another edition of Big Picture. Today we focus on the just concluded G20 Summit in Hangzhou, China. While throughout the summit, the participating countries really pandered to their domestic constituencies in terms of what they focused on, there remains a larger question about what were the real outcomes of this G20 summit. Now, the summit concluded with a consensus on world growth and how to boost it, but the finer details of what that plan is remain to be seen. Also at display was a geopolitical power play between the world's superpowers. So tonight, the question that I'm posing to my panelists is that whether G20 is an exercise in futility and how can the grouping make itself more relevant? Joining me tonight are Sanjay Kapoor, editor, Hardnews, Pramit Chaudhuri, foreign editor, The Hindustan Times, Professor Srikanth Kondapalli, professor of Chinese Studies at the Center for East Asian Studies at JNU, and Ashok Sajjanhar, former diplomat. Sanjay, I'll start with you. I mean, the stats are there about G20. They represent 85% of global GDP, 80% of international trade, 65% of the world's population. And did this particular forum, this particular summit, really take it forward the interests of the globe as it was conceived to do so in post that economic crisis of 2008?
You know, since 2008, since the time these people, the Prime Ministers of 20 most important countries came together, there has been a certain amount of movement. They've been able to understand the nature of the economic crisis, how a collective stimulus can really help in increasing spending power. So in a certain way, we were able to cross the hump as a world economy. But this is a work in progress, and I think there's a recognition by G20, and in a certain way, China was able to present itself as a major power, the way it unveiled or unpacked this vision of how the world economy has to go forward, talked about innovative practices, that old practices are not going to work. So I think it is not easy to quantify exactly what happened, but you must understand that when you have a G20, there are a lot of work that happens at the sidelines, where the heads of state meeting each other. For example, if you look at the Russian media, they would say that the President Putin was able to achieve a lot. He had major deals with Erdogan, the President of Turkey, had some good meetings with many other heads of state. So in a certain way, what you make out of it, what you expect from a G20 also matters. Like for our Indian Prime Minister had gone there, he wanted to bring to the fore Pakistan's involvement in terror activities. He wanted to put Pakistan in a corner, talk about black money.
But then the question that begs to be asked is G20 about domestic considerations? I'll put that question to Pramit and I'll come back to you. Is it about, did we see a lot of pandering to domestic constituencies, domestic problems, domestic issues that needed to be addressed? Even China, for that matter, doing a little bit of that.
Well, every summit, any major multilateral summit, for example, and in fact, any major global meeting like the UN General Assembly and so on, the part of a large component will always be about the bilateral and the domestic audiences. The core of it, however, what should happen in a successful summit is that once they've done all of that and when they get together, the leaders at the summit should be able to put together some degree of a coherent, convergent opinion about what to do. And as has been mentioned, the G20 summit in Pittsburgh was the best example of that, where you saw a very comprehensive agreement on how to solve the global financial crisis. In this G20 summit, as has been the case in the past few G20s, however, we did not see any real coherent proposal or agreement among the countries. And the core divide, which China and backed by India said, is that the developed world, especially the Western countries, their lack of structural reform and emphasis on quantitative easing, eventually printing money in an attempt to get their economies going, is proving to not be a success. They're getting very little growth, but in return, they're printing an enormous amount of money, which is now starting to damage the world economy. Let's put it this way, 1/3 of all the savings in the world today is getting negative interest rate. Because they've printed so much money that nobody's prepared to give interest on that money anymore. And so China and India, which are attempting, and I think India more than anybody else in the G20 has done the most in structural reforms, is saying that we're doing the hard political work of actually changing our economies to compensate for the problems in the world economy. You guys in the West are doing nothing. All you're doing is printing money and saying we're not going to do anything. And this is a disaster because this will lead to another financial crisis. the failure to come to an agreement between these two schools of thinking at the G20 is a clear sign that the G20, at least in this summit, has failed to accomplish what I would say its primary goal is.
All right, Mr. Sajjanhar, in light of Brexit, in light of what Pramit was talking about protectionist movements that we've seen in Western powers as well, and what Sanjay also pointed earlier to was China's stewardship. So when 2008 happened, when the first G20 happened, at that point in time, Barack Obama was the leader that the world turned to, in a sense, sort of stewarded the G20 through that economic crisis. Is China taking over and leading it, and can it take everybody along?
You know, let me very quickly come back to when it all started, 2008, as you mentioned. George W. Bush, he was the president at that time, and he was the one who said that the G20, which had actually started in 1999, that was in wake of the Asian... 97 was the crisis, but 1999 is the beginning of G20, when the finance ministers and central bank governors got together on the sidelines of the fund bank meetings. And they said, let's try to see how to have better global economic governance and financial structure. So both in 1999 as also in 2008, there were crises that were facing international community in the face. And so they were able to take action against that. At the moment, we can see Brexit, rise of isolationism, rise of protectionism in different countries, that is there. But you know, the crisis is not of the magnitude as we have seen at with the downfall of the Lehman Brothers and in 1997. So in that sense, you know, there has been pressure on China to open up its market. There has been pressure on the other countries to do away with the financial profligacy that is there and to keep on accumulating debts. So in that context, and you know what you mentioned also, the agenda of G20 has become so heavy because it's become like a Christmas tree. Everyone sort of, you know, wants to peg. So it is no longer related only to trade, investment, finance. You have agriculture, you have education, you have health, you have water, you have medicine, you have every issue that is there. So in that sense, it's become very heavy. But then one of the yardsticks would be as to when the decisions are taken, how well are they complied with?
Right.
And you know, there has been a study that has been done by the University of Toronto, and it says that from November last year, from the Antalya Summit till the 3rd of September, and they have made out that the average compliance level of all the commitments made was 78%. The highest was by US and UK, 88%, not bad. India, Italy, Germany, 85%. So in that sense, decisions that have been taken have been complied with. Now there are no big bang, no visionary sort of decisions that have been taken to resolve it.
All right, so they might not have made the headlines, the decisions, but they could, in terms of impact, create long-term impact, is what you're saying. I want to get in Professor Kondapalli also, because we talked about China, we briefly mentioned that, and China's stewardship, China's rise. In fact, China's snub to Barack Obama, and the fact that it was held in Hangzhou, China. So as far as China is concerned, shift in geopolitics, that has been on for some time, and a lot of power play between superpowers was at display.
Indeed, I think the Chinese policies have shifted in the last 10 years from what they used to call as keeping a low profile, Tao Guang Yang Hui in Chinese, to that of accomplish something, Yo So Tso Wei, which the G20 today represents that accomplish something onto the international scale. It started with the Beijing Olympics in 2008, Shanghai Expo, and a host of other events that China had organized, including the APEC Summit in 2014, November. So this is a kind of coming out of party for the Chinese onto the international scale. And part of this is for their own domestic economic concerns, which is mainly in terms of how they can maintain the trade related issues, as manufacturing sector has become a major component in the Chinese economy. So they need to keep the trade protectionism, as some of the panelists have mentioned, at bay. In addition to also keeping its own domestic market intact. China is not opening up its domestic market under the WTO considerations. But if they can ward off this pressure till this year, the WTO would give them a kind of waiver on the domestic market opening up. So this also acts as the trade protectionism issue and other issues raised in G20 also act as a kind of serving the national interests of China. I would also say that the subjects which are covered by Xi Jinping on innovation, trade, on keeping the growth rates up for a healthy economy, and so on and so forth. All these are intended again to maintain the edge that China had in terms of the second largest economy and also as the largest trading partner for over 128 countries.
Right. All right, so China really coming out and really dominating the show there, Pramit. But in terms of a shift in geopolitics, are we witnessing that? There was that snub to Barack Obama that was talked about. There's also a kind of a vitiated atmosphere between the United States and Philippines over certain terms being used for the President of the United States. So in that sense, China really dominating and the US being shown a little bit of its place in that
Well,
sense?
I think, anyway, in the past several years, we have seen China make a very determined effort to make it clear that, at least in the Western Pacific, that they are the power, the dominant power, and they're the power of the future. And that all of these countries in that region, especially those who are treaty allies of the United States, should recognize this. So you've had the revival of a territorial dispute with Japan, and you've got this remarkable claim on the South China Sea, where in effect you've gone and taken an international water body. Okay, this is ours. And it's not because the water body is of any consequence, it's basically a test of American power. Can your friend America defend you against our claim? And they've succeeded so far. I mean, what has happened, particularly with ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, is they've crumbled. They've not been able to put up a united front against China. At least 3, if not 4 members have effectively sided with China within ASEAN. And a lot of the members now are looking at the United States and saying, well, for 2.5 years you did nothing during this dispute and you only started to come in. So for China, in many ways, they can rightly say that we've actually done a very good job of showing how weak the United States is in the Western Pacific. And I would argue that for Xi Jinping, the Hangzhou summit and many of the things of what he does continues to be, he wants to use those not merely to show that China is on the world stage, enhance his own leadership position in China, but also to continue to show that the Americans are no longer the main game in town as far as the Western Pacific and East Asia is concerned. So deliberately forcing Obama to lose face, if you wish, in Hangzhou is a perfect way to fit this into this. I would argue it's a bit adolescent for a mature power to do that, but for China it seems to have, it fits in with what he wants to accomplish. So yes, I think they will continue to push exactly this kind of agenda. And I think the next step will be to ensure the failure, which may happen on its own anyway, of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is effectively a trade agreement designed to contain China. It's not economically particularly beneficial to the United States, but it is useful for keeping China. If that fails, which is quite likely given the fact that, given where U.S. politics is going, it'll be in many ways, I wouldn't say the final nail, but one very powerful nail in the coffin of America's credibility in the Western Pacific.
All right, so interesting power play over there as far as geopolitics. But Sanjay, coming back home, talking about what India wants to achieve. And for India, from a certain perspective, G20 is quite important because it allows India access to this kind of a fora where as its partner, as the neighbors do. Therefore, the Pakistan comment that was raised by the Prime Minister over there. But in terms of response to that comment, what did the countries have to say? Is anybody going to be acting or putting pressure on Pakistan? That doesn't seem to be happening. I mean, China and the United States use Pakistan at their own convenience.
You're very right, because the G20, the very structure of it, also reflects a change in the global architecture. It provides countries like India and China a greater space than what used to exist when you had the G7, which was limited. When Russia and China were there, but countries like emerging power like India, Brazil weren't there. So in a certain way, our country manages to deal with different powers, is able to reach out and convince them. And when the Prime Minister decided to speak on terror, his endeavor was to actually use the network that he builds, reaching out to all these countries, that there is a problem which needs to be sorted out. So, for that matter, the US, China, all are cognizant of what Pakistan is, and they have their alliances, they have their deals, they know exactly how to leverage Pakistan as a country, as somebody who can fulfill many objectives. So that doesn't really help us, but in terms of articulation, India did whatever it could. And it, in a certain way, as it's been repeated time and again, PM was also speaking to the domestic constituency that our fight against terror, he's able to take right up to G20, talk about it, and there is a continuity in where he conducts his politics and even his foreign policy. So from that angle, it is fine. But what more did we achieve? I think that the jury would still be out whether it really made much of an impact, because he also talked about squeezing black money and certain things about how the economy, the world economy has to be run. We are going through a certain kind of demand squeeze, and many people feel that the rate at which the economy is stuttering or moving, it could benefit if there is a certain amount of loosening that would take place. Right. So that understanding has to also reflect itself in the way many issues are to be articulated there. So in a certain way, PM managed to say what he had gone there to say. He was very assertive, aggressive in reaching out to leaders. Photographs with President Obama and his interaction with others is a clear indication of how there is a greater confidence how he conducts himself.
All right. So, Ashok, the point being that ultimately it seems that most countries were pandering to their own self-interest and their own domestic constituencies, as they would normally, even in the course of foreign policy. So, for a fora like this to be moving forward, what do you think would be the most important thing?
You know, let me make just one or two additional points. Number one, that it is the only forum globally on which we have developed and developing countries together. Right. And they are coming together, and of course the genesis of G20 is that it started with the economic crisis, the financial crisis, the subprime mortgage lending crisis, etc. But over the years, it has not limited itself to that. And so the leaders are there and they can discuss. Of course, there are open statements which are made in the plenaries. There are also the backroom parleys. And I think that is where the benefit and the strength of this forum lies. Because, for instance, if you look at it, the Prime Minister met, of course, the host president, Xi Jinping. This was after his meeting in June in Tashkent on the side of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. But he was able to put the point of view that both our countries need to be very careful and have to respect each other's aspirations, strategic interests and concerns. And also on the question of terrorism, he was able to address the BRICS countries on that. That, you know, these terrorists, they don't own banks, they don't own... With Turkey, he was able to talk about the NSG membership. So across the board, it is not only the open statements against terrorism that are relevant. I think we need to go behind that also. His conversations with Theresa May also. His conversation with Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. That, whether it is NSG, whether it is International Solar Alliance, whether it is different areas of cooperation. So I think it was not really only talking to the domestic audience, but it was taking our own interests much forward in whatever way it was possible.
All right. So, but the ultimate point being that, is the forum then effective? I mean, can India reach out to these countries in a better manner other than forums such as G20? I'll put that question to Professor Kondapalli also, because ultimately, what works more? Do regional fora like an ASEAN, a SAARC, do they achieve more work, or does a G20 and this kind of a grouping achieve more in terms of actual outcomes? And even, is it even a fair comparison?
Well, I think there is an incremental progress in the G20 process over a period of time. For example, the IMF restructuring had taken place in last December, with the voting rights of China and India increasing to over 6.2 and over 3.3% points. So there is a tangible benefit in some of these as part of the G20 mechanism. Secondly, there is also the pressure mounted on the financial and lending agencies for investments and protection of these investments in the infrastructure projects abroad. There is also the pressure brewing up if they have not really done the job, pressure brewing up through the AIIB and NDB, National New Development Bank of the BRICS. So I think while the progress has not been very spectacular, the kind of subjects that have been raised and the progress on ground reality, yet I think there is some, as the other panelists have also mentioned, there is on many issues there has been some progress, both from national point of view as well as at the international management of issues on primarily economic, but also spilling over into the security and political fields. So I would say that there is some progress made through the G20 process.
All right, we'll stick to that point of view with you. But Pramit, coming back to the point of security, I want to just that because while the G20 was happening, North Korea fired missiles off its coast. There have been extended conflict in Syria. There is a lot that the world needs to come to address these conflicts. But it seems that one-upmanship and what happened in the photo ops and all that dominated the headlines more. And rather than a resolution of such crises, that a forum like G20 really can address together.
Well, G20 is not really a security forum. It was created to handle global economic issues. And at present, while it does discuss them on the margins, as you know, Putin and Obama, for example, attempted to discuss Syria, failed to accomplish what at least the Americans wanted to do. And presumably other countries do so on a bilateral level. As you've mentioned, India raised terrorism with pretty much everybody it met. Ultimately, the G20, if it struggles to get a convergence on economics, it has zero convergence or even capacity to look at security, which is really either handled by regional organizations like NATO or theoretically the United Nations or other similar organizations. So it's not a very good place for security arrangements, partly because the countries come in there on the basis of their economic might. I mean, it's supposed to represent roughly 75 to 80% of the GDP of the world. You get in largely on the basis of the size of your GDP. There are always a few countries invited by the host, 3 or 4 countries are invited in additional capacities, but they're not really core G20 members. So you go in there really with an economic agenda. And the bilaterals, you might talk security, but ultimately the agenda is always economics, very little about security. There's no secretariat system, there's no treaty structure. And on the military side, there's zero. There's nobody brings their defense minister to the G20, or very few people do. Rarely even foreign ministers very often don't show up. So you have it's not really designed for security. If security impinges on the economy, I could see them raising this on a major. Ultimately, it's the economics. This is what the G20 is about.
All right, and as far as economics are concerned, Ashok, Sajjanhar, the global economy is still growing under 3%. So that is a problem. I mean, pre-2008, it was growing at about 6%. So in that sense, still quite a distant dream for that economic coalition to move together forward.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that is why different countries have different interests. And that is why there is very little meeting ground. But still the countries get together and they, in this 7,000 words, 9-page document, which is spanning such a large number of areas, such a large number of subjects. So I think it fails to ignite or excite the common people. And that is why, even if you look at in China, or even internationally worldwide, except the experts who are poring over the written word. Otherwise, it doesn't really catch the imagination of people. And that is why they're looking at, whether the staircase was provided to Air Force One or whether President Obama is looking the other side, because this is just the tidbit too. But I don't think it would be right to say that the G20 summit has been hijacked by instances of this nature. Yes. The North Korean test of the ballistic missiles, that of course is a worrying aspect. But it did provide an opportunity for the United States and Russia to discuss Syria. It did provide an opportunity both to the United States and China to declare that they are going to ratify the COP21, the Paris Agreement, and put that in also. I agree that security issues don't come very easily or naturally to G20 because they were not designed for that. But then there are issues like terror financing, and that brings terrorism right into the center of this particular debate. But I think what really the real strength of this forum is there is no secretariat, there are no there's no permanent secretariat, there are no staff members, etc. It depends upon the country that is dealing with this. So, but the real strength is that all these countries are coming. For instance, here we had these 20 countries, there were 8 guest countries, there were international organizations, IMF, World Bank. So all of them, it is not as large as the United Nations. It is a smaller number, and it is also not so fragmented. For instance, now in Laos, Vientiane, there is going to be the East Asia Summit, but there the numbers are much smaller. Here it is the large developed countries and the large the emerging economies. So in that sense, all of them coming together and getting an opportunity to discuss common issues, share concerns, interests, and also bilaterally try to see how common agendas can be moved forward.
Okay, Sanjay, final word to you. We just have about a minute, but as Ashok was also saying that a lot can be achieved and everybody comes with it, but given the fact that there's such disparate goals that everybody at the end wants to achieve, it'll always be incremental change with the G20, won't it?
You know, as I said earlier, you know, it provides an opportunity for 20 countries which matter, which have control over 85% of the world GDP, to come together and talk. And it's an yearly event, and a lot what happens behind closed doors. There's certain kind of opaqueness as to what transpires. You have 20 heads of state who talk with each other. I mean, if you talk to some of the Sherpas who are there, they say a lot of meaningful discussion actually takes place. So it may not really reflect in those 7,000 words that have been written by bureaucrats who use very dense language, which is very difficult to comprehend where it is going. It's really very status quo when you say look at the language. But the truth is that, you know, there is a network of 20 world leaders who can pick up the phone and talk to each other. You can have situations where Erdogan is being taken aside by Putin, talked about what has to be done, look at the list of things that they've been able to accomplish, what is going to happen in the next 2-3 months. Similarly, the meeting between Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi. You know, there are a lot of issues which, you know, things happen far rapidly now than they ever happened before. Every day, you know, new alliances are coming in. You have a conflict situation. Say, for example, in Syria, the Turks are getting in, the Chinese, the Americans are doing certain things. So in that kind of scenario, you have these world leaders who are talking with each other, finding either complicating an issue or at least finding an issue, but they're talking with each other, which is very important.
All right, in summation, I think talking was the outcome, and I think that's also quite a good thing. On that note, we'll have to wrap up, but Sanjay, Kapoor, Ashok, Sajjanhar, Pramit, Chaudhuri, and Professor Kondapalli, thank you very much for coming in. Well, that's it in this edition of The Big Picture. We'll be back tomorrow with another issue. Thank you so much for watching.